Dimensions. This is one of those topics that if you talk about it, people will either think you are really smart or really crazy. Dimensions are something that it's become somewhat of a household subject. Everyone knows about it, but very few people actually think about it. Very few people actually try and really evaluate what's going on here. If I say something like, we are 3D, you know what I'm talking about. It makes complete and perfect sense to you. But if I ask you, what do I mean by that? Are we in the third dimension? Are dimensions places? Or are we 3D ourselves? That would make dimensionality some sort of state of being. Both examples aren't accurate. Dimensions aren't places, at least outside of science fiction. And dimensions aren't a state of being, but more like they are a state of seeing. And I'm using this term seeing kind of with air quotes because we obviously see with our eyes, but we also smell in 3D, we hear in 3D. All of our senses are 3D. It is just the nature of our existence on this plane. So rather than this term seeing, a better word is perceiving. We perceive in 3D. So a dimension is simply a way through which reality can be perceived. I obviously know that the exact definition of dimensionality within physics is a tad different, but for the sake of making this palatable, for the sake of making this understandable, you can view it as this, that a dimension is simply where perception intersects with reality. Reality is made up of energy. When you get right down to the bottom of it, reality is some sort of abundance of energy. Everything is energy. And the way that a particular consciousness is able to convert this energy into information, this ultimately dictates your dimensional perspective. It will ultimately dictate the reality that you are able to see, the reality that you can perceive. And in this video, I want to talk about exactly what I mean by this. And I want to also explore the implications of this. A perfect example of what I mean by this intersection between consciousness and reality. If you aren't blind, you can see. That is to say that you have vision. And what you are able to see is called visible light. However, as we all probably learned in the 6th grade, that there is an entire electromagnetic spectrum of various frequencies. What you are able to see with your eyes is where your visual perception intersects with this frequency. It is where your visual perception intersects with reality. That in actuality, there is this large range of energy. However, you intersect with it only at this short little bandwidth. That if you look at this little thing on the screen, in actuality, it's some sort of circle that is rotating. However, you only see a little worm that is sort of crawling in a circle. And based on that, this short little bandwidth, you form your entire worldview on it. It is your reality. And we call this visible light, but that doesn't mean that what lies outside of this is invisible. We know that there are different types of creatures that can visually perceive different ranges of this electromagnetic spectrum. So it's not like it's invisible. It's just not visible by humans. Now, am I saying the rest of the electromagnetic spectrum exists in some sort of different dimension? Obviously, no, because we know that it's there. We have developed instruments to be able to measure it. However, this is an example for you to understand where I'm about to go with this. What do I mean by intersection with reality? As I stated, all of reality is energy. Everything that you experience is some sort of energy. I don't care what theory in physics you subscribe to, what tip of the spear in the sciences that you are currently investigating. No matter which way you go, it's always going to be some sort of energy that is causing everything to happen, because energy is things happening, as I stated in my previous video, which I'll have on the screen. So if all of reality is some sort of manifestation of energy acting out, what exactly is energy? Well, to us, the way that we perceive energy, it manifests as some sort of waveform, some sort of excitation of a field. This is how we see energy, and this is simultaneously what it means to perceive in 3D. Energy to us appears as some sort of pattern. Our ability to see patterns is what gives meaning to this reality that we live in. Look around you. Don't you see patterns everywhere? Not just in some sort of schizophrenic type of way. Everything that you see is some sort of pattern. Everything that you experience is some sort of pattern, because within this third dimension, energy moves in a prescribed way. We call this a waveform. If you look at what a waveform is, it is simply a very basic pattern. And this very basic pattern combines with other patterns, and they just sort of bounce back and forth and form all kinds of wild and wacky permutations that ultimately lead up to what we are all experiencing right now, this world of 3D objects that when you put on your shirt, you don't see it as a bunch of vibrating atoms. You see some sort of 3D object, because this is where you intersect with reality. This is how you perceive energy. But what if I told you that energy is not what you think it is? That energy is not some sort of excitation of a wave field. That, when you look at the standard viewpoint of how we view a waveform, it is some sort of up and downness, some sort of crest and trough. And I know that there are several different types of waveforms, but in general, this is how they all look. They form some sort of basic pattern. What if I told you that this isn't what energy is and how it functions? That in actuality, what energy is completely unlanguageable. If you want to get spiritual and woo-woo, it's the Tao that cannot be named. It is, the will of God, or however you choose to phrase it. But to keep this somewhat based in metaphysics, I'll get woo-woo and mystical towards the end. To keep this based in a way that normal people can conceptualize this, it is simply something that no human being can describe. And this thing that we call energy, I'm using air quotes here, what we call energy is simply where we intersect with this unlanguageable phenomena. And this intersection is what we have all come to call third dimensional perspective. This is what makes up our entire reality. And for whatever reason, we are sort of stuck viewing this energy this way. To us, energy is always in some sort of motion. Things are always happening. Things can never not be happening, because our perception, our perspective simply does not allow it. This is why we cannot conceptualize nothingness. It is just, I say that it lies within the realm of forbidden thought. And the very reason why we can't help but to perceive this energy this way is the very reason why we perceive in the third dimension. We cannot conceptualize it in any other way because those concepts do not exist to us. It's kind of like how you see people when talking about dimensions, we can look at the second dimension. You'll be observing some sort of scenario in the second dimension, and to you within this higher dimensional perspective, you can just see things and say, well, why doesn't this character just go around this object? It's because within that dimension, going around an object simply is not a concept that exists. The same way that to us, experiencing energy, not in motion, is simply something that doesn't exist. Energy always has to be moving. And you looking at this 2D scenario, you know about this third dimension, but to this thing that you are looking at, this 2D scenario, to it, the thing that you know is very real simply does not exist. Not that it's just really difficult or some sort of very complicated possibility. It's that it's not even allowed to perceive it or think it the same way that you cannot perceive nothingness. It's just something that you are not allowed to do. What I am saying is that the same thing applies to us, obviously. And ultimately, as I say in many of my videos, there are simply questions that we don't even know how to ask. The same way a 2D perceiver, this term around, this concept to go around, isn't even something that it is capable of thinking. The same way nothingness is a concept that we are simply incapable of thinking. And what dimensions are, if you view this actual energy that I'm talking about, not where we intersect it, not this energy that we commonly talk about in academics, but what reality is actually comprised up of, this unlanguageable thing, it is infinite. And this infinite phenomenon is divided up into all of these various subdivisions. And these various subdivisions are divided up once again, and it just keeps on dividing and dividing, almost like some sort of fractal with this infinite detail. This is why I believe that fractals kind of resonate with us so profoundly. Or as I stated in my previous videos, it is just patterns that are within patterns that are within patterns, and it just goes on and on like this for, as far as we can tell, forever. A perfect example is, going back to the electromagnetic spectrum, that you have this spectrum. This spectrum is divided up into subdivision. You have gamma rays, microwaves, radio waves, etc. And within these subdivisions, there are subdivisions. For example, we have the visible light subdivision, and visible light is divided into, we have red, orange, yellow, and even those are divided up into all kinds of various colors: orange, red, yellow, fuchsia, all kinds of, I'm not an artist, at least a visual one, so I don't know all of the colors, but you see where I'm going with this. As far as experience goes, one of these subdivisions is what dimensions are, that you have this infinite unlanguageable thing that can be experienced in an infinite amount of ways. And what a dimension is a plane through which it can be experienced. So for us, we perceive within the third dimension. For whatever reason, within this third dimension, there is taste, touch, sight, hearing, smell, a couple of other senses that other animals are able to have and perceive. And these various senses combine and they form their own little micro subdivisions. The way that something smells and tastes combines into a different sense. Then the way that something smells and tastes on a sunny day is another subcategory. Then that can be broken down to a sunny day in June. And then, you can just keep branching out all of these different ways of perceiving reality. And ultimately, you will end with your own unique life. You are like a kind of like a micro dimension of this giant fractalized process. And all that spirituality is, these great mystics and spiritual type people from the past, they just solve this, whether it's via some sort of mystical intuition, but to me, it's just obvious. And all spirituality is saying that there is something special and magical about this thing that is happening that is beyond all of our comprehension. That's about it. That is the birth of what spirituality is. The rest of it is just, lagniappe. It's just whatever your own personal tastes are, whether or not you like India, whether or not you like white Puritan, European type, it just all depends on your own perspective in this whole grand scheme. Because this is what all of these major figures saw. They just called it a different name, gave it a different face. And unfortunately, all of these people, eventually, they had to pass on. They had to die, essentially. And they passed this realization on. And now we have some animals running these institutions. But for those of you who are interested in your own journey, this is a good place to start. But going back to these dimensions, as human beings, we are these finite creatures. So we have to intersect with reality somewhere, and we just happen to intersect with it within this 3D perspective. That if you were able to perceive this unlanguageable cause in its entirety, you would be God, for lack of a better term. You would be able to possess perfect knowledge about something. Within statistics and set theory, you would be this mythical set that contains all other sets. And obviously, that is simply just not the case for us. But what does all of this imply? This implies that everything is real. Everything is here. Or in other words, nothing is lost. There are just simply things that we are not able to perceive. And where we lose reality, or in other words, where we are not able to perceive, it is a prime marker that it lies within some other dimension. It's not that it just simply doesn't exist. It is just non-perceivable. We cannot think it. I've often on this channel termed this place the realm of forbidden thought, that if you try and metaphysically conceptualize this, it will lead you to some sort of singularity, some sort of point that just you cannot perceive it. And the closer you get to this point, things begin to break down and become completely illogical. And the reason why it is completely illogical is because logic is a concept within the third dimension. Logic is essentially the various arrangement of zeros and ones, of things being on and off, of the energy going up and down, this crest and troughness of energy. This is what it means to see things in 3D. I do believe that this is what was being spoken about within, the Christian creation myth with these characters of Adam and Eve, that They ate of a particular fruit, and this fruit gave them the knowledge of good and evil. This is the birth of polarity, the birth of dualism, the birth of this zero and one type thinking. There was some sort of position that we held where we were one with some sort of greater consciousness. And I call it the point at which we fell into logic. I don't take many of these stories to be literal, but I do believe that something transpired within our deep ancestral past that caused us to begin to see things in 3D. It is the realm of material objects. It is the realm of logic, however you choose to phrase it. But when you think of concepts where logic begins to break down, it is the opening to a different sort of dimension. And within this singularity, concepts such as nothingness, concepts such as infinity, concepts such as the solutions to a paradox. I mean, a paradox is quite literally a visual, a physical manifestation of the limitations of logic. You can see with your very own eyes. Logic cannot describe this thing you're trying to point to, but you know that it's there. The solution to a paradox exists within some other dimension. But as I stated, it's not like dimensions are places. It is just a way of perceiving reality. It is some sort of different type of perspective, so that when your logic begins to fail, when you encounter some sort of contradictory, paradoxical scenario, there is some sort of missing perspective that is limiting what you are able to see. The same way how if you try to tell a 2D character to just go around, they can't see that solution. This is why, I know that the Big Bang Theory kind of fell out of favor. It kind of fell out of the academic zeitgeist. But whenever someone would hear about the Big Bang and this initial cause that caused everything, the first thing that people think is, well, what caused the Big Bang? And what caused the thing that caused it? This constant trying to pinpoint this exact position of beginness. This is why it is so elusive to us, because it is quite literally extra dimensional. We cannot pull it into this 3D world. And keep this portion of the video in the back of your head, because I'm going to circle back to it towards the end of the video when I get all woo-woo and mystical. But within these other dimensions, we try and make these various models for them. For example, I believe it's common knowledge that within physics, you have this fourth spatial dimension, which is considered time, and that any sort of perception from this dimension, it is some sort of different way of perceiving time, that time for it just simply doesn't work the same for us. But the important thing to keep in mind is that we cannot conceptualize what it's like to actually see things in 4D. It is quite literally beyond our ability to perceive it. Perceiving in 3D, it's what we do. But one thing that I do believe is that reality will always imprint meaning onto the observer. So if you were to be able to perceive in 4D, it would not be some sort of chaotic range of elements. Everything just wouldn't look like strings. It would be some sort of meaningful object. So to perceive in 4D, the life of a human being, it wouldn't be some sort of worm. It would be some sort of meaningful object. The same way that when you look at your cell phone, when you look at your mother, you don't see a bunch of vibrating particles. You see your mother. You see something that is meaningful. And all of these different dimensions, they will be host to their own patterns that imprint meaning on to whatever is observing them. And to a 4D perceiver, perhaps your birth and your death and everything that lies in between that you consider to be your life, that entire process to it appears as some sort of meaningful object. Perhaps that your life, we really are some sort of flower, some sort of crop that is growing. This is what many spiritual texts and theologies, this is the type of language that they use. When you bite into a hamburger, you don't taste, the life of the cow. You don't taste the farmer's sweat and labor that went into taking care of it. All that entire process collapses into a single moment, and you call that moment yummy. You call that moment tasty. And perhaps to a 4D perceiver, your entire life, all of these circumstances, they collapse into an entire moment that it perceives as some sort of meaning, some sort of meaningful object, meaningful experience, if experience is even a thing. In the eschatology of within Christianity, for example, there is this poetic language of us being some sort of harvest that will be reaped at the end. And I guess this is the portion of the video where things get a bit more woo-woo and mystical, that even mathematically, we know that there are these other dimensions out there. It's not like this is some sort of cuckoo friend science. The ultimate question is there consciousness there? Is there forms of consciousness that can perceive in these dimensions? And as far as I'm concerned, it appears obvious to me that yes, there is. Many of these academic-minded type people, they would have you believe that there's just this empty plane with nothing perceiving, that there is this fourth dimension of time, this axis of time that we know is an available perception, but there's simply nothing there perceiving it. It is all just theory and conjecture that we're just talking about in this 3D space. But if you have any sort of, you could call it mystical intuition, it appears obvious that this unlanguageable cause that we're all trying to understand, it very well could be consciousness, that consciousness isn't an energy per se. It is some sort of unlanguageable thing, and we are some sort of iteration of it, filling out this plane of this third dimension. This third dimension is jam-packed with all kinds of consciousness. Us, the animals, the plants, it's all conscious. This is why physics cannot be separated from metaphysics, because once you start talking about dimensions, you start talking about reality. You start talking about perception, which will ultimately lead you right back to consciousness, this mystery that we just cannot seem to wrap our heads around. And it's just common sense that we have the luxury of being able to see the second dimension, that if there was a character in front of us within the second dimension, it would be completely unaware of our existence. It would be by definition unable to perceive us because we are extended out in a plane that it cannot comprehend. It cannot see it. But for whatever reason, we think that this does not apply to us, that if there are these perceivers from this fourth dimensional perspective, they would be completely inert to us. Not that we couldn't see them, but that they would be completely unperceivable. Now, this is the portion of the video where things get a bit more spiritual, a bit more mystical and woo-woo. Within metaphysics or philosophy, if you choose to look at it that way, there is this whole idea of something being greater than the sum of its parts. This is something that is obviously on its own face value true, that you're a human being, but what exactly is a human being? It is some sort of whole that is made up of all of these individual parts, that you aren't just a arm, two arms, two legs, a circulatory system. All of these different systems and parts come together to make something greater than them that we call the human being. This is the case for everything. And the exact point at which something transitions from being one thing to another is unobservable to us. This is this whole big debate that we have with, women's rights and pro-choice versus pro-life, that the exact moment when life begins, where we draw this line on when life begins, is something that we cannot perceive when it happens. So we just kind of all make this guesstimate, this non-perceivability of where something ends and another begins. I believe that it is extra dimensional. And this same phenomena is occurring with our consciousness, our mind that we have. As I mentioned before, that if you try and conceptualize certain things, you run into some sort of singularity, some sort of point to where your 3D perspective is not allowed. Logic begins to fall apart because logic is not allowed. And I believe that this point is some sort of stepping off, some sort of transition of the whole becoming greater than the sum of its parts. And what life actually is, it is one unfolding. It is one continuous process, this unfoldingness, this continual growing and this continual deepening of your perception. That everyone listening to this, you were a baby at some point, but that perspective is completely barred off from you. Which butt cheek did the doctor slap you on, the left or the right? You have no clue. And I think that ultimately what consciousness is doing, in a similar way or in a similar pattern, there's that word again, in a similar pattern that you were born and went through all of these transitionary periods of your life that you really don't have much access to anymore. Consciousness is unfolding through various dimensions, that within this 3D plane, you're born, you experience all of these patterns, and you pass on. But when you pass on, you transition to some other plane, and this process continues there. That your perspective is just perpetually being deepened as you, if you want to call it ascending through dimensions, it is perpetually being deepened through this process. And just like how now you're an adult and you can look at children and know that all of these things that they think that are important, when they're crying about something and you just think it's silly, whatever is this proximate plane that we go to, we will look at this 3D perspective, this 3D world, and kind of laugh and think that I can't believe that they think all of these things are important. I can't believe that they think that this money is important, that they are sacrificing their souls for this paper. People always say, one of the first things that people say when talking about any sort of theology is, if God is real, why do all of these bad things happen? But perhaps it is just you lack perspective on what bad actually is. And these things that you think are bad is, the equivalent of when your 4-year-old drops their ice cream and they think that the world is ended. And you're just thinking, buddy, wait until you have to figure out how you're going to pay your mortgage after you're laid off in 30 years. And the person right now that's getting ready to jump off of a cliff because they're drowning in debt, some other perceiver is looking at this like, wait until you get to where I'm at. It gets even crazier. And I think that this unfolding just happens perpetually. Until, this is, I guess, where I get into my prophecy bag. Until you reach total perspective, until you return to, if you want to call it God, whatever you hold dear in your heart when you look up to the sky, until you enter back into a total perspective. And this total perspective, I can only describe it as pure absurdity. It is a position that everything and anything is possible. This is why logic cannot enter. It is not logical. It is completely irrational because anything is possible. With logic, there are rules, but this is where rules go to die. Everything is true. 1 plus 1 equals 10 is true. 1 plus 1 equals 11 is true. Something can be true and not true simultaneously. I mean, this is why I laugh when people say that they can try to use logic and math to comprehend God, if you want to call it that. It's like trying to use a butterfly net to catch a waterfall. It just doesn't work. But this is turning out to be my longest video yet, but I just had a lot to say, so I'm going to leave it here. Please like the video if you haven't already, comment, and subscribe to the channel if you are new. I have a locals page. I have a Patreon where you can support the channel. I have a PayPal where you can support the channel. I have a Discord, and I also have Instagram. All of those links should be in the description. I know the certain links, they expire, so I'll try to stay up to date on those as well. And until next time, y'all have a blessed day.